Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to walk you through some of the most impactful editing techniques that I use to help take your images from this to this. In Lightroom, and you can see that I've already made a few minor adjustments to this image just to get it started. But the first thing that I really want to focus on is color balance, and more specifically my process in color balance, which can be kind of a multi-stage process. So it goes without saying, color balance is critical, and you really need to have your image in a good starting place, otherwise everything else can kind of get thrown off from there. Not that you can't correct it, but getting color balance dialed in up front is critical. So the first thing I would do just to start is play with the temperature and tint sliders and ask yourself, when you were in this location, what were you seeing? What did you feel? Was it a cool snowy day like this? Was it a warm, bright sunset? In my case, this was obviously a very cold, snowy day. So, having some level of those blue tones to evoke that cool feel is very important. But also, it was a beautiful sunrise where the sky was just going off with these reds and pinks. So I want to make sure that I'm being, true to that aspect of the image. So what I want to do is, if anything, it looks maybe a little bit too blue to me, let's try warming it up just a bit. Sometimes I'll go to the extremes and then adjust back down. So I think maybe something like that. And then there was also, like I said, these deep pink and purple hues, and to me this image looks a little bit green, a little bit cyan, so I want to pull it over towards magenta a bit in the tint. And you can see how much that really brings out the sky in this image. If anything, it might be a little bit too much magenta here in the mountain, but we can always correct for that. Maybe I pull it back just a bit. Yeah, maybe something like that. Okay, and then another tool within color balance is the color grading dials. So I'm not going to play around with these dials right now. I want to show you a different way that I do this in Photoshop. But this is something that maybe I come back to as I progress in the image, and maybe I want to add a little bit more tint in the shadows or in the highlights or midtones. But for now, we're going to leave this be. So what we'll do now to continue working on color balance is we'll take the image into Photoshop. All right, so we have our image loaded up in Photoshop, and what I want to do now is select a color balance layer. So we come down here, select color balance, and that'll open up a new layer. And I want to start with the shadows. Now, when it comes to shadows, typically you want to have, cooler shadows, warmer highlights, depending the scene. And so what I might do here is try and add in just a bit more blue into the shadows. You can see when I pull the slider over to the right towards blue, you get a lot more blue in the darker areas of the image here. And then conversely, if you go to the left, it's warming it up. So I tend to do this very subtly. I might play with, maybe adding +2 there. That's subtle, but I think if you go any further than that, it starts tending to be a bit too much. So let's go +2 on blue. And then moving up to the magenta green slider here, often what I'll do is just kind of play with the dials a bit and eyeball what I'm adding into the image. So, to me, the magenta green balance already looks pretty dialed. And if we go to cyan red, again, I think we're pretty balanced when it comes to the shadows. So before moving forward, we'll toggle a quick visibility check. Subtle, but you can see a bit more blue added into the darker shadows in the image. All right, so moving into highlights, I definitely want to add some warmth to the highlights. So, let's play with this a bit. I think maybe a -5 value here looks pretty good to me. And then again, I think adding in more magenta, more red into the highlights here, since this is a beautiful kind of red, magenta, orange glow sunrise, and all of that light, was hitting the mountain face here and kind of creating this red magenta bounce light in addition to the clouds that you can see here. And we really want to bring that out. So let's add in a bit more magenta to the highlights. I think maybe a value of, let's see, maybe -4 looks pretty good to me. And then let's add in maybe a touch more red. But you can see that really brings out the color in the sky. So I think something like +3 looks pretty good to me. You definitely don't want to overdo it, which you can fairly easy on this. So I try to be pretty subtle and just tilt the photo more in the direction that I know it needs to go, but not overdo it to where things get out of balance, because we're also going to add more saturation to this image as well. So we want things to be nice and balanced. So let's just do a quick before and after. So before, after, and yeah, you can see, just the sunrise and these clouds is way more prominent. We still preserve the cool tones and the shadows here, and then the warm kind of red bounce light that's hitting the mountain from the sun coming up over the ridge is kind of brought back into the image. So I think that's pretty good. I mean, already there, that's fairly transformative, and we're just getting started. One more quick thing on why I like doing this in Photoshop is you can really control what you're adding in without going too far. And if you do go too far, you can always just pull back the opacity, maybe do something a bit more subtle. So here's where we started, here's where we finished. Maybe we want to pull it back just a bit to bring in a bit more balance. Something like this, I think, looks a bit more balanced to me. So before, after, yeah, I think that looks good. Okay, so the next technique I want to discuss is adding an Orton effect. Now, I do this in a particular way that maybe not other photographers do, so I want to walk you through my process. And Orton effect can be impactful. It's kind of subtle, but it adds this dreamy, kind of ethereal quality to the way light is hitting the subject in your image. So to properly use an Orton effect, you're going to need to use a layers mask, and you can do this in a bunch of different ways. I like to use Tony Kuiper's. Lumenzia is another good tool, but I'll link to Tony Kuiper's tool in the video description so that you can follow along with me. So to get started, we want to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and pixel radius. Typically what you want to do is set it to about the amount of pixels in your camera sensor. For me, that's 61. For this image, it's a 16:9, so I'm not using my full sensor. It probably is about 35 pixels of the full sensor, so we'll stick with 35. And now this has added the Gaussian blur to the entirety of the image, but we only want it in the lights. So I'm going to select a lights 1 mask, and then I'm going to hit apply. You can see now it only applies to the lights. This is still way too strong, so we're going to take the opacity down to maybe 10%. I typically like to stick between 10-15%. I find that works pretty well. It's subtle enough and you still get the effect. So we're gonna go 10%, and then we're not done. I like to add another layer to this, and what I do is go to Camera Raw Filter, and this has selected the whole mask. So what we're trying to do here is bring a little bit more warmth to the light, a little bit more pop. So I'm gonna add in some warmth, a bit more magenta as well, and then up the vibrance and the saturation, and let's up the exposure just a bit, a little bit less than that, and add in a bit of contrast. And this looks overdone, but again, remember, this is gonna only be added at 10% opacity, so it will be a subtle look. So let's go ahead and select apply. So we'll give it a quick look before, after. It adds a nice subtle glow and a bit of warmth into the lights of the image where the sunlight's hitting the mountain, and I think the effect works pretty well. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is add in a bit more atmosphere, add in some depth to the image. And so to do that, we're going to select a lights 1 mask, and then we're going to add a dodge layer and switch this to soft light. And then with the white brush, we go just a bit away from white. And then let's do maybe 20% opacity. Actually, let's go with 10%. And then 40% flow. So it's nice and subtle. And then with the bigger brush, I want to add this into the furthest part, the background of our image. And any of the subject, that is furthest away from the camera is where I want to add this the most. And then I'm going to leave the foreground of the image untouched. And so what this does is it helps emphasize the atmosphere that was in this scene, and it helps create a bit more depth. So, it's more contrasty in the foreground, and as the eye goes out and as the subject goes further out, it's a bit more hazy, a bit more diffuse, like it would be, in a normal 3D environment. So, it helps take this 2D image and give it more of a 3D look. So before, after, before, after, yeah, I like the way this looks. And you can see, how just this little step here, adds, much more depth and even pop to the image and creates an effect that, I think is pretty pleasing to the eye. Okay, so the next thing I want to do to this image is add in some contrast. So to me, the image is still pretty flat. It's not horrible, but it needs a little bit of work. So one of the biggest adjustments that I like to use within Photoshop is the levels adjustment. So we're gonna go down here and select a levels adjustment layer. And then we're just gonna add in, a bit more punch, a bit more contrast. And you can see as I've done this, the darkest parts of the image are a bit too crushed. Overall, the contrast looks good. I might pull that back maybe just a touch, something like there. But still, we have these crushed parts of the shadows. So in order to counter that, what I do is then go to the output levels here. You can also use this bar as well, but let's go with output level maybe 4. I think that looks pretty good. So let's do a quick before, after, after. So you can see there's a lot more contrast added into the image. It has a bit more pop. And we didn't necessarily go too far on the shadows. This still might need maybe a bit of work, but I think it's good for now. So another tool I like to use when it comes to contrast, and usually towards the end of my workflow, after I've already added in kind of the bulk edits like we've been doing, is the Nik Collection. Color Effects in particular has a few useful tools that I like. So let's open this image up there and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so we're in Nik Color Effects, and what I want to show you here is just the clear view filter. So what clear view does is it acts as sort of an intelligent filter that applies micro contrast to the image, but it does so selectively. So kind of like the dehaze tool in terms of effect, but much more intelligently, much more selectively. It puts it in the right places instead of in broad strokes that might crush your image. So let me show you what I'm talking about. You'll see on the right hand side of the image is where the effect's taking place, and you can kind of see the before over here. I'll just pull this slider over so we can get a better sense of what it's doing to the entirety of the image. So here's where we started, and I think maybe something like right around there. You can see just how much detail kind of pops in the image now with the micro contrast on the face of these rocks. It has a good effect. It adds a lot of pop to the image. This might be maybe a touch juiced up, but we can always back that off within Photoshop. Okay, so another tool that I like within the Nik Collection is Pro Contrast. So I use this almost as kind of a last ditch kind of eyeballing of how the contrast is in an image. When I'm sitting down processing an image and I'm staring at it for, maybe an hour, 2 hours at a time, sometimes it's easy to, lose the forest for the trees. And this kind of helps me, eyeball, did I go too far? Did I go too far, in the darks of the image or the lights? Did I go too far in the color contrast that was added? So with that, I'll start here with the color contrast cast slider. And this is a handy tool. This kind of shows, anywhere as you pull the slider up, it'll try and balance the image from where you started. So this is recognizing that, there's a lot of magenta in the image. And as I pull this in, it pulls in a bit more, cyan and green. I think, maybe I'll just course correct a little bit. Let's say add in about 5%. And that will kind of balance the color cast a bit more from where we started. Before, after. Yeah, to me that looks, a bit more natural. And then the contrast sliders themselves. So, as I pull this up, it's bringing in a bit more pop into the highlights. We might be a bit more dull there with the way we did the contrast before. So I think, again, subtly, maybe like 5% here. And then if I go to the dynamic contrast sliders to balance it out a little bit more, I do like the effect it's applying here. Let's go maybe, I think 15%. And then let's go before, after, so you can see, much more pop. I do think maybe the darks of the image are crushed a bit. So if we go down the shadow slider, we can pull that up a bit and try and compensate. And again, before, after. Yeah, I think that looks really good. It makes the mountain face look very prominent. And if we play with the slider here, you can just get a sense of everything we've done. We've taken the image from this to this, which is really, a transformative effect in my mind. So Nik Collection is a powerful tool. There's some great stuff within their suite of software. I've used them in my workflow for a few years now. And they actually did reach out to me recently, and I asked if they could, give a code that I could give a discount to my viewers. So if you're interested in checking out their software, I'll leave a link as well as my code. I believe the code is just Matt Adams, and it gives you a 15% discount on their software suite. So feel free to use that at checkout if you want to check out their software. All right, so let's hit apply and let's take this image back into Photoshop. All right, so with the image back in Photoshop, one good thing about using Nik Collection as a plugin is we're making all of these adjustments in their software as a layer. So, as we bring that layer back into Photoshop, if we went too far, we can dial this back to where we think, is more natural, more comfortable. I think, maybe we did go a touch too far, so I'm gonna dial this back to, say, maybe 85%. If we go before, after, really transformative effect. I like what we did there. All right, so I'm just gonna merge the layers and we're gonna save this and take it back into Lightroom for some final adjustments. All right, so we got our image back in Lightroom, and let's make a few more adjustments just to add the finishing touches to this image. First thing, let's sharpen it up a bit and let's mask that in. So we just get it within the details. Looks pretty good to me. And then I want to add some saturation back into the image. So what I like to do for saturation is use the camera calibration settings at the bottom of the Lightroom panel. So typically I'll use the blue primary. I think this adds in, the most natural color. But when you do that, you're going to add in, as you can see, it favors the blues. So it kind of makes the image a bit too cool, a bit too blue cast for my liking. So anytime you're using the blue primary slider, you're going to want to also, depending the image, back down on the blue saturation. So in this image, I think we definitely need to take the blues down a bit. I think maybe something like that. Yeah, that might be a little bit too far. Let's add in just a little bit more blue. I think that looks pretty good to me. And yeah, I think, we're looking pretty good here. Let's maybe just add in a little bit of a vignette. And, there might be a few things that I'd want to do this image. I would tend to, walk away from this image for a bit, come back to it, let my eyes refresh, and, see if there's any other adjustments I want to make. But, I'd say this is 85% of the way there. And, we've come a long way. I mean, you can see the image that we started out with. I mean, it's a raw file, but it looks pretty flat. And look at the amount of pop and detail that we've added into this image through just a few, maybe 5 different editing techniques, but you can see that they add in to make something very impactful. So yeah, if you enjoyed that video, if you found value in what I shared, a like, comment, subscription, all of those are greatly appreciated. And yeah, hope you guys are all doing well. I hope to be back with you real soon. The plan is to be out in the field for the next one, so we'll see. It's just a cold, blustery winter day right now, and so I'm inside, cozy, and editing some photos, and thought I'd share some techniques with y'all. Anyways, take care everyone. I'll see y'all real soon.